Hello everybody, my name is Happy and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today I will be taking a look at Bloodbath in Baghdad, the murder of the Iraqi king and the rise of Saddam Hussein by Mark Felton Productions. As always, I will have a link to the original content down in the description below. I highly encourage you to head over there and show Mark Felton Productions some support if you like what you see here. I've been trying very hard for these first few weeks of my channel to cover a diversity of topics, a diversity of countries, and a diversity of video channels on YouTube in order to, make sure there's a little something for everybody and to get a better feel for what people like, what people want to hear from me, that kind of thing. So I thought we'd head to the Middle East today. And part of the reason I chose this particular topic, which there are not a lot of videos about, is, again, like several of my other videos, because of family connections. So I'll be right back in just a moment. So, I have mentioned several times in the past that one of the reasons that I've gotten so involved in history throughout my life was because of my family. My mother was obsessed with Western United States history, both from the American side and from the Native American side. She used to drag me around to all the ghost towns, to all the old Wild West cities, as well as to various Native American sites. I've been to Wounded Knee, I've been to the Sand Creek Massacre site, I've been to Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, Acoma Sky City, several reservations. I've also been over to several times the Gathering of Nations in Albuquerque, the Crazy Horse Monument, and dozens of other places as well. She even wanted to move at one point to Deadwood, South Dakota, just to be close to Wild West history. And she just loved the area, but my dad convinced her it was too cold. My dad knew what he was talking about. Well, when I was a kid, my mother used to tell me the story about how she had met a Persian prince, and she thought he was very handsome. I actually never believed this story when I was younger. A part of me did, because she said that my grandfather had introduced her to him. And that kind of tracked, because as far as I can tell, my grandmother knew everybody in the world. My grandfather, I should say. I know he took pictures of like 8 presidents and many dignitaries. He was a professional photographer his entire life. He'd worked in some part of photography, even before it was really photography per se. And so I didn't put it completely out of the question, because if anybody could introduce her to a Persian prince, it would be my grandfather. But I still was pretty skeptical. Until she told me a little later that, yes, she had met this Persian prince, and that later he had been killed in a revolution. And she described the scenario. And at that point, I was learning more about history, and I'm like, this sounds familiar. So I asked her, when you say Persian prince, could you be talking about Iraq? And she's like, yeah, that was it. Like, was this prince's name Faisal by any chance? And she said, that sounds right. So I asked her, do you have any pictures of this prince? And she sent me several pictures, including this one you see right here on the screen. This is not a Persian prince. This is the king of Iraq, a picture taken here in my hometown by my grandfather. So, yeah, this fairy tale that I thought my mother was telling me is true, or at least part of it. She said he had come home to dinner with them. I don't believe that part is true. I believe that she's conflating that with a different bunch of visiting foreign or Middle Eastern dignitaries, because I do have pictures of Arabs at my grandparents' house with my grandmother. I think that's probably what she's remembering there, but she was also remembering King Faisal as well. I think she kind of conflated the two of them to some degree. But it's very clear that my grandfather actually did meet him. I have since then tracked down some of the newspaper articles where some of his pictures were used, which further confirmed that he was here. and that my grandfather was in there interacting with him and spending time with him. So that's part of why I chose this video, because this video is going to talk about the unfortunate death of King Faisal, which seems kind of like a pity. But let's get into this video and see where it takes us. Definitely the same guy.
Many viewers to this channel are veterans of one or both of the recent wars fought in Iraq.
Right.
But you, and indeed other viewers more widely, may wonder why Iraq ended up as a dictatorship under the rule of Saddam Hussein.
I remember when the first Iraqi war broke out, I had just moved out of my parents' house, probably I think the same year. I was on my own for the first time. I had just bought a house of my own for the first time. And this war breaks out, and I remember watching the attacks on Kuwait and the counterattacks on Iraq on TV and just being dumbstruck. This is one of those memories that I won't forget, just because it came at a time in my life when I was basically on my own for the first time. So having this war break out and seeing all this on live TV was a very memorable experience for me.
The answer to that question is an event which occurred on this date in Baghdad 66 years ago in 1958 that fundamentally changed Iraq and placed it on the path to Saddam's controversial rule.
That picture, by the way, that I showed that my grandfather took of King Faisal II, he took that in the summer of 1952, so about 6 years before this revolution.
It was an event, as with so many events in the Middle East, partly caused by historic British interference in the region.
Oh, yeah.
And the event was a terrible massacre that still polarizes opinion in Iraq today. The British knew Iraq well from World War I, when it was called Mesopotamia, part of the Ottoman Empire. In 1917, British forces had managed to capture Baghdad after some military reverses against the Turks, and following World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dismembered, and a British Mandate of Mesopotamia was announced.
Right. So this is part of the whole Sykes-Picot Agreement and related treaties and issues right after World War I, where the former Ottoman Empire is divided up. Most of it is set up as protectorates by Britain and France primarily. And this is going to cause issues, because a lot of these Arabs thought they were going to be getting their own countries, which they do, but they're not really independent. They're being controlled by these mandates, and they feel like the British and the French are exploiting their resources, exploiting their people. So yeah, this is a fertile ground for tension, for unrest, and for revolution and the overthrow of British or French-supported governments.
In fact, Britain gained a whole series of such territories throughout the Middle East following the demise of the Ottoman Empire, another being the Mandate of Palestine. Britain also controlled Egypt, the site of the strategically important Suez Canal, and had done so since the late 19th century. And the Suez Canal, which linked the British Empire together, was co-owned by Britain and France.
Not for much longer.
Britain also had great influence in a place called Transjordan, today's Jordan, along with much of the Arabian Peninsula being under British protection. In 1921, the British decided that Iraq needed a king. They chose for the king.
Yeah, now notice what they just said there. The British decided Iraq needs a king. Not the Iraqi people, but the British.
King, a foreigner, which was a ploy they had done many times all over.
And not just do they need a king, but it's going to be a foreign king. In this case, it's going to be from a family, the Hashemites, who still to this day rule Turkey.
The world. A good example of this happened in 1833, with the newly independent Greece was given a monarchy, King Otto, who was Bavarian. and later a German-Danish monarchy, which lasted until the Greeks got rid of the royals in the 1970s. The man the British chose to be king of Iraq was the third son of the Grand Emir and Sharif of Mecca. Raised in Istanbul in Turkey, King Faisal I ascended the throne in 1921. As I mentioned, he was not Iraqi, but rather he was from the Hashemite family, a royal family that ruled several parts of the old Ottoman Empire from 1916 onwards, including briefly Syria and also Jordan to the present day. King Faisal I was a Sunni Muslim, which is the minority branch of Islam in Iraq, which is a majority Shiite country. However, Faisal I fostered something called Pan-Arabism, a desire to unite Iraq with British Palestine, together with the French mandates of Syria and Lebanon, all under his rule. If such a thing had occurred, the majority Shiite Muslims of Iraq would have been transformed into a minority in the new kingdom, which was a problem for some of their leaders. Faisal, however, was a wise king. He worked hard to be a friend to both Sunni and Shiite, and to the Jews and Kurds of his kingdom in Iraq. He also realized the value of Iraq's oil, which was largely under British control, which he knew would be vital to economic development of his poor nation.
And oil in the Middle East is going to be a huge source of problem as well. During these mandate periods, you'll have problems with this in Iraq, with British controlling the oil. You'll also have the similar problem with British control of oil in Iran a little later. That's going to lead to the whole Shah of Iran crisis and the rise of modern Iran under the Ayatollah Khomeini and then his successors. Oil is really the root of a lot of the chaos in this region. But on top of that, it's European colonialism, or not imperialism. They're trying to control the oil, and that's just not going to stand for long. They're also trying to control things like the Suez Canal, which is going to be a big issue coming up here just in a moment. I say that because I know that there's no way they're doing a video on the Iraqi Revolution of 1958 without getting into the Suez crisis, because they are linked.
He also made efforts to build up Iraq's army with the help of British military advisors. In 1932, the British decided to make Iraq independent, though it was a strange independence, in that Britain continued to exert huge influence over the new king and his government, and to base large numbers of troops in the country. The reason for this you can guess at. It's the black stuff that comes out the ground. However, King Faisal I didn't live long as an independent monarch. In 1933, he died at the age of only 48 in Bern, Switzerland. He was succeeded by his son, who became King Ghazi, and like his father, the new king was a staunch supporter of Pan-Arabism, and also wanted the British influence in his country ended. King Ghazi supported a coup by the army, which replaced the civilian government, which caused tensions with elements of the Iraqi populace. He also put about the idea that neighbouring Kuwait, at that time also a British possession, should be annexed by Iraq. Something Saddam Hussein also believed in and attempted, of course, many years later. However, King Ghazi didn't live long either, killed in a car crash in 1939 at the age of only 27. Many Iraqis believed the new king had been killed on the orders of Prime Minister Nouri al-Said over the king's demands to annex Kuwait, something which the British did not want to see happen. Ghazi was succeeded as king by a child, King Faisal II. This posed a serious problem. The new king was only 3 years old, so
at this point he's going to go into a regency, and I believe it's his cousin that is the regent. Now, there is family rumor that my grandfather actually knew Faisal's regent during his time in World War II. I don't know how accurate that is. Again, that might be conflating this family with a different one. So I don't know how true that is. I do know that this supposedly happened on a tiger hunt And I do know that my grandfather did come back from India with a tiger skin rug that he shot himself. So there is some evidence that this happened. Like I said, I think this story might conflate two different groups of Arabs, or in this case, Iraqi.
Regent was appointed, King Ghazi's first cousin, Prince Abd al-Ilah.
Right.
When World War II broke out, Iraq became an official ally of the British Empire and the Western Allies. However, a military coup d'etat was staged in Baghdad in April 1941 by pro-German army plotters led by 4 Iraqi generals. They were working with German military intelligence, the Abwehr, hoping to achieve full independence for Iraq with the help of the Germans and the Italians, to see the British ejected from the country and the foreign monarchy gone. King Faisal II, Prince Abd al-Ilah, and Prime Minister al-Said were deposed and fled into exile abroad. Britain, however, acted decisively to sort the mess out. British and Empire forces attacked the rebels, capturing Baghdad after a lightning campaign and ejecting German and Italian support from the country. The Regency was restored, and British troops would occupy Iraq until 1947. The young king, however, spent his time in exile in England, being educated at Harrow School, a top private school in London, alongside his second cousin, Prince Hussein, later King Hussein of Jordan.
Wait a minute. I'll be right back. Sorry about that. When I saw this image of Faisal meeting his cousin Hussein, the picture of Hussein reminds me of that picture I mentioned that I have of my grandmother at their home meeting with a couple of dignitaries from somewhere in the Middle East. I am still not convinced that's not him. Like I said, my mother insisted that a prince visited them there, but I'm not convinced that he is either. I can't find any record that he was here in this area. He was in my home state around the time the picture was taken, but I don't think it's him. But I had to stop and look through my family photographs real quick, because this face actually reminded me quite strongly of one of the faces in that picture, but I don't think it's him. But for a second there, I was like, wow, I may have just solved another mystery. Don't think so, and there's certainly no record of him ever being here in this town.
After the war, he returned to his country, and he also toured the United States and became very interested in development projects for Iraq.
Right.
In May
now, Faisal
1953, Faisal attained his majority and became ruler in his own right. But the rise of Pan-Arabism was making Iraq and elsewhere in the Middle East politically unsettled.
Yeah, and now remember, Faisal is educated in Britain. He speaks fluent English, and this is going to be a problem for him, because this is a period where Pan-Arabism is really, really starting to grow. And having this king who is clearly being influenced by the British is going to be problematical. It's going to be of a concern to a lot of these Pan-Arab nationalists. Even if Faisal himself isn't sympathetic to the British, he is, but even if he wasn't, the very fact that he's educated in Britain and so on is going to make it look bad.
Faisal was still very young and very inexperienced, and he relied on his father's cousin, Prince Abd al-Ilah, and his prime minister for advice. Some of this advice was very controversial. Forces opposed to him, his rule, and his government were emerging in Iraq. Pan-Arab nationalism, anti-imperialism, in Iraq, of course, specifically anti-British sentiment, and the rise of communism everywhere. Economic inequality further strained the nation. During the Regency period, Prince Abd al-Ilah had signed an agreement with Britain in 1948, a very controversial agreement that permitted the British to continue to maintain a military presence in Iraq seemingly forever. And this was confirmed by Faisal II in 1955, when he...
Another very bad move at this period of time, when the bulk of the Iraqi people are trying to move away from British influence. These guys are embracing it, at least politically.
Rubber stamped the agreement. This was not popular. Huge Iraqi protests erupted. The British wanted to keep control over Iraq's absolutely vital oil fields.
Of course they did.
Growing economic inequalities between a rich elite around the king, who were close to the British, and the rest of the country led to increasing communist activity in Iraq as well.
Yep. And this isn't unusual either. We just recently watched the Russian Revolution. Does this sound familiar? Yeah, it does. A young ruler who really doesn't know what he's doing. He's inexperienced. He didn't have his father figure to help train him. He's dealing with in a situation where there's a growing disconnect between the haves and the have-nots. You've got communist movement rising. Sounds very familiar, doesn't it?
In 1952, the Egyptian monarchy had been overthrown by a radical pan-Arabist army officer, Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser. In 1956, Nasser had boldly nationalized the Suez Canal to keep all of its revenues for Egyptian development. But the canal's owners, Britain and France, immediately launched an invasion of Egypt to regain control. An invasion that also saw the new state of Israel attack Egypt, capturing Sinai.
Yeah, that was a huge deal.
The Suez Crisis and its outcome generated popular revulsion for the 1948 Baghdad Pact that had given Britain the right to garrison Iraq, and though he hadn't actually negotiated the pact personally, King Faisal II had signed it on the regent's advice. Many Iraqis began to see the young king as part of the problem. In February 1957, an opposition group was formed called the Front for National Union. It included National Democrats, Independents, Communists, and members of the Ba'ath Party, and socialist pan-Arab political group.
The Ba'ath Party will be coming back later.
Within the Iraqi officer corps in the army, the Supreme Committee of Free Officers was formed.
And the free officers are going to be major players in what's coming. It's basically a military coup.
On the same kind of organization that had brought Colonel Nasser to power in Egypt. The latter was a serious threat. Faisal and his government ultimately would have to rely on the army to keep them in power if anything actually occurred. Attempts were made to ameliorate angry officers with generous benefits, but it wasn't successful. On the 1st of February 1958, Syria officially joined with Egypt to form a new country, the United Arab Republic. The Iraqi government did not recognize the new state. However, due to blood ties between the Iraqi and Jordanian royal families, both being from the same Hashemite family, these two nations now strove to form a strong alliance themselves. On the 11th of February, King Faisal II went to Amman in Jordan to sign an agreement. On the 14th of February 1958, the countries declared the Arab Hashemite Union between Iraq and Jordan, more commonly called the Arab Federation. As Faisal was older than King Hussein of Jordan, he became the head of state and head of a unified government, with King Hussein his deputy. A great many ordinary Iraqis were very suspicious of this new political alignment, particularly as Britain vocally supported it. They thought it was another ploy to continue British influence in Iraq. The groups within the army and civil society that were opposed to British influence, and also very critical of the governance of Faisal II and his Prime Minister, began to plan a coup to get rid of them by force. The plotters wanted Iraq to sever its ties with Britain and the United States. It was a fact that Britain at the time dominated all sectors of Iraq's governance and its economy, and this was deeply resented, particularly when countries like Egypt had managed to throw off such influence in a successful coup.
One thing they don't mention is that during the Suez Crisis, initially you're looking primarily at Britain and France getting involved to protect their interests in the Suez Canal. You get Israel coming in and basically upsetting everybody in the region by taking over the Sinai. And this also brings the United States and the Soviet Union into play. And when this is all over, those two are kind of going to be the big boys in the neighborhood calling some of the shots. So this kind of changes some of the balance of power and how this situation is evolving, because now it's becoming part of the Cold War. It's becoming part of all the proxy war stuff that's going on between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So the situation is just getting more and more complicated. I just thought I'd bring that up because they just mentioned the U.S. is involved here, but they really don't say how or where they got involved. And a big part of that was a reaction to the Suez crisis.
Even some members of the Iraqi elite were beginning to become interested in Nasser's brand of pan-Arabism, and in particular army officers, who had formed the Free Officers Movement, based on Nasser's model. Prime Minister al-Said's position had been weakened by his support for British and French intervention in Egypt during the 1956 Suez crisis. Iraq was becoming politically isolated from other Arab states. Nasser's announcement of the United Arab Republic with Syria was the catalyst for revolution in Iraq. The Kingdom of Yemen also joined the United Arab Republic soon afterwards. Attention then turned to Lebanon. Syria was supporting the Arab nationalist movement in Lebanon that was trying to depose the pro-Western government there.
Right.
If Syria was successful and Lebanon also joined the UAR, Iraq and Jordan would be completely isolated. So the Iraqi Prime Minister began to provide military aid to the Lebanese government. But when al-Said attempted to send Iraqi troops to Jordan to bolster that country, it was a step too far for the Iraqi opposition. The Free Officers Movement inside the Iraqi army decided to act. Led by Brigadier Abd al-Karim Qasim and Colonel Abdul Salam Arif, the movement orders issued to Iraqi units to go to Jordan provided the perfect cover to launch a coup. The Iraqi 19th and 20th Brigades of the 3rd Infantry Division were to march to Jordan,
That's the world's smallest
Baghdad
mustache.
The 3rd Division's commander, Major General Ghazi Dagestani, was completely loyal to the regime of Faisal II and was unaware that 2 of his senior officers were part of a plot to depose the king and government. Colonel Arif directed the 20th Infantry Brigade directly towards the capital, while Brigadier Qasim remained in reserve with the 19th Infantry Brigade. Early on the 14th of July 1958, troops of the 20th Brigade captured the capital's main broadcasting
Troops of the brigade, all I see are sheep. Are those the troops?
station, which would become the headquarters for the plotters. An announcement was made over the radio to the general populace of Iraq, during which Colonel Arif demanded an end to imperialism and the government and proclaimed a republic and the end of the royal regime. An interim government was announced to consist of a 3-man committee until free elections could be organized. Next, 2 groups of soldiers were dispatched, one to deal with the king and one his hated prime minister. King Faisal II was at the Rahab Palace, the principal royal residence in Baghdad. The palace was well guarded by an elite bodyguard unit of soldiers. The Royal Guard, however, was not part of the army chain of command. It was in fact under the personal authority of the monarch, so it was theoretically immune from the revolutionary aspirations of the Free Officers Movement.
Theoretically.
With the king at Rahab Palace were Crown Prince Abd al-Ilah, the former regent, his wife, Princess Hayam, Abd al-Ilah's mother, Princess Nafisa, King Faisal's
I think,
aunt,
survives
Princess
the revolution.
Ahmadiyya, and other family members and servants. It has been suggested that King Faisal received a warning of an impending coup from the British via their embassy, though this cannot be confirmed, and indeed he seemed to take no action if he was forewarned. Rahab Palace was not to be Faisal's permanent residence. A new palace was then under construction, which was to become his residence following his planned wedding to Egyptian Princess Fazila. It is often reported that Faisal II ordered his royal guard to offer no resistance to the rebellious soldiers that turned up at the palace gates, but in fact some firing had been exchanged between soldiers of the 20th Brigade and palace guards. Small arms fire for the time being. Hearing the firing, and pleased to learn that a coup was underway, an army officer stationed near Baghdad, Captain Abdul Sattar al-Abusi, who had been training troops at a compound on the city's outskirts, gathered some of his men together and headed to the palace, ordering his men to join in the fighting.
Sorry I'm being so quiet, but I know a little bit about this, but not a whole lot, so I'm just not sure how much I can really contribute. I'm trying where I can, though.
For good measure, Abusi had an artillery gun brought up, and some sources claim that either 4 shells from an artillery gun or mortar bombs were fired at the palace. Negotiations commenced for both the surrender of the royal guard and what to do with the royal family trapped inside the palace.
Right.
The official story suggests that an agreement was reached whereby the royal family would surrender to the rebellious soldiers in return for an assurance that they would not be harmed and would be escorted from the premises and taken elsewhere.
If they got that assurance, they were lied to big time.
Shortly after, amid smoke and dust, King Faisal II emerged into the royal gardens, accompanied by other members of the royal family, some servants, and 2 officers of the royal guard. They were all unarmed. At this point, there are 2 versions of the reason for what happened next. The plotters later stated that they intended to exile King Faisal and former regent, Crown Prince Abdal-Illah, abroad. However, many suggest that the coup plotters planned to kill the royal family to end once and for all the Hashemite dynasty in Iraq.
I mentioned this in the Russian Revolution oversimplified reaction. When you're doing something like this, you're staging a coup, you're trying to set up your own government, your own regime. You don't want to have remnant of the old regime still around for people to rally behind, for counter-revolution to rally behind, for other revolutions to rally behind. You got to get rid of anybody that's a threat to you. That's in part why Tsar Nicholas was executed along with his entire family when there was a risk that the White Army would liberate them. They did not want a rallying point, a figurehead. There's no doubt in my mind, there may not be proof, but it would be highly unusual for military officers like this to let these guys go, because that's just leaving a somebody for a resistance to rally behind. You just don't want to do that.
And the governmental regime, and ensure that the British could not attempt to restore the king or any future heir to the throne via a counter-revolution.
Bingo.
It did make sense from their point of view. The person held responsible for the massacre that followed was Captain Abusi. He stepped forward from the group of soldiers, confronting the king and his family in the kitchen garden of the royal palace, and opened fire on them with his submachine gun. The 23-year-old king, who had been scheduled to fly to Istanbul that morning and thence to London to see his fiancée, was shot down along with all the other members of the party. Several killed outright, others badly wounded. Only one person survived the massacre,
right.
Princess Hayam, Abdal-Illah's wife. She was hit in the leg or the hip. That she survived was probably due to the fact that some of the soldiers in the garden that day were members of her family tribe, and that she was treated in hospital for her wounds and later recovered. Much controversy surrounds the condition of King Faisal following the shooting. It is often reported that he died of his wounds in a car that was taking him to hospital, but Princess Hayam reported that Captain Abusi actually finished off the king and Prince Abdal-Illah with his pistol, shooting both of the men in the head in the kitchen garden, where they lay mortally wounded.
This isn't the end of it either.
Princess Hayam was adamant that the coup soldiers deliberately opened fire on the royal family, and that Captain Abusi delivered the coup de grace to the aforementioned men, later recalling that, quote, Faisal's head was split in 2 like a coconut, end quote. The members of the royal family, both the dead and those who were still alive, were bundled into cars by the soldiers to be driven to the Ministry of Defence building. But along the way, the corpses of the king and the crown prince were both dumped in the street, where baying mobs of civilians horribly defiled them.
They did.
King
that is
Faisal
confirmed.
Was stripped naked, and his body was reportedly hung from a lamppost.
Yeah,
Prince Abdal-Illah, considered by the coup plotters to be a traitor to Iraq.
He got it much worse. They hated him more. He got it much worse. There are photographs of his body, and just don't look them up if you don't want to be disturbed.
Dealings with the British during the Regency and many other reasons became a target of the crowd. His naked corpse was dragged through the streets behind the car before his hands and feet were hacked off. What was left of him was then hung from a balcony.
Yeah, there's pictures
Once
of
the
him
mob
hanging
had
from the
been
balcony.
sated, the bodies were cut down and, along with the other corpses and the wounded, driven to Al-Rashid Military Hospital for identification and/or treatment. In the evening, a hole was dug near the hospital, and Faisal II's corpse was unceremoniously dumped in it and covered over. The rest of the dead were cremated, and their remains were tossed into the Tigris River. The hated Prime Minister Nouri al-Sayed was also eventually apprehended after he attempted to escape, and he and a companion were both shot dead. Al-Sayed's corpse was also horribly abused by a mob before being buried in a cemetery that evening. The corpse of Faisal II was disinterred during the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and reinterred under a marble tomb next to that of his father, King Ghazi, in the restored royal cemetery in Baghdad. The coup caught the Western powers completely by surprise. The CIA believed that Egyptian leader Colonel Nasser was behind it. Brigadier Qasim became Prime Minister and Minister of Defense, while his second-in-command, Colonel Arif, became Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of the Interior, and the legislature was replaced by a revolutionary council. The new government ruled over a broad coalition of different political factions who were not ideologically disposed to cooperation. In 1959, the new Iraqi regime broke off ties with Britain and the United States and instead made alliances with left-wing and communist countries, including the Soviet Union. Prime Minister Qasim was himself overthrown in a coup launched by the Ba'ath Party in 1963, and prominent Ba'athist General Ahmad al-Bakr became Prime Minister. Thousands of left-wing or communist Iraqis were subsequently rounded up and killed, with Bakr himself being overthrown in a counter-coup by Deputy Prime Minister Arif in November 1963.
This is common too, where once a government's been destabilized this bad, it's very possible to have this, rapid-fire, constant succession of counter-revolutions, additional coups, so on and so forth, because the governments never have a chance to entrench themselves.
3 years later, a Nasser-backed coup was attempted against Arif but failed. But in 1968, the Iraqi Ba'ath Party again took power in a bloodless coup, this time with al-Bakr as Prime Minister. One Ba'ath leader who was very close to the Prime Minister at this time was a person called Saddam Hussein. Saddam was appointed Vice President of Iraq by al-Bakr, and he nationalized the Iraqi Petroleum Company and presided over the Second Iraqi-Kurdish War of 1974-75. When al-Bakr resigned in 1979, Saddam took power as Prime Minister, though in reality he had in fact been the de facto leader of Iraq for some years. He ordered a bloody purge of the Ba'ath Party and in 1980 invaded Iran, beginning a decade-long struggle there, until in 1990 he accused Kuwait of stealing Iraqi oil and invaded, precipitating the First Gulf War. It is clear to see that the massacre of King Faisal II and his family, the 14th of July 1958, made possible the rise to power of Saddam Hussein and all the conflict and human suffering that would entail. If Faisal and his advisors had been more attuned to the growing anti-imperialist and pan-Arabist movements that swept the Middle East in the 1950s, perhaps Faisal could have kept his throne, and Iraq's history would have been altogether different. Whether Iraq became a better country following Faisal's ugly demise is open to debate, as is whether Faisal and his family's rule was better or worse than that which followed his death. His death and his legacy are still hotly debated in Iraq today. But we can all, I'm sure, agree that the massacre of the royal family was a bestial act in and of itself, and one that changed Iraqi politics and society, and indeed world history, forever.
That would actually be a good alternate history discussion, is what happened if Faisal does realize that he needs to break free from Britain and join this pan-Arab movement that's going on.
Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share, and also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.
All right, that was pretty good. I wish I could have contributed more, but like I said, Middle Eastern history, I had several classes on Middle Eastern history, but it's so complicated, and things like this, I know the broad strokes. I've never really gotten into the details of most of Middle Eastern history. A little bit here, a little bit there, but the amount that I can contribute and feel confident in what I'm saying is not that great. So I tried to contribute where I could. Most of this was just me watching and nodding my head and saying, right, yeah, I realize that. Hopefully we'll find something where I can contribute more eventually. But I do want to make sure we're covering other parts of history, a wide variety of countries, a wide variety of time periods, and a wide variety of creators. So I had to do this. Anyway, I hope you found some of that interesting. This is something that doesn't get talked about probably as much as it should, because like he just said, this revolution against King Faisal and the monarchy in Iraq leads directly to the chain of events that lead to Saddam Hussein, which leads to the Iraqi war and everything that follows after that. So this is one of those dominoes that is pretty significant in world history. So it's something we probably should be at least surface level familiar with. Anyway, thank you for joining me, and I'll talk to you all next time. Till then, bye-bye.